Welcome to Unbiased Science,
where we bring scientific method to the madness.
We're your hosts, Dr. Jess Steier
and Dr. Sarah Scheinman.
And today we are talking about something that is all over the news. It's a very hot topic, the topic of fluoride. So I'm trying to think, honestly, well, actually, you know what? Let's set the stage for folks. So Sarah and I were chatting before we hit record on this episode, and we could talk about this for several hours, for days. I mean, there's so many different deep dives we could do on all the different aspects of this. But our goal with this episode is to really focus on some high level key takeaways. When you're sitting around the holiday table, if this topic comes up, you'll have some talking points, you'll have some context. But we have done a ton of written content and also infographic content on this topic. We have a lot more planned. So for that, definitely check out our page, and we'll link to these things in the show notes. But Sarah, maybe to kick things off with a definition, which you love, what is fluoride? Let's start there. What are we talking about?
All right, so fluoride has been coming up a lot in the news and in the media, and it's been spoken about in the context of water fluoridation. So what does this mean, and what even is fluoride? Like, let's start with that maybe. So fluoride is an ion of is a negatively charged ion of the element fluorine. So think periodic table of elements, back to chemistry class. Fluorine is just one of the elements on the periodic table. And an ion is just when the amounts of electrons and protons are different than what are usually found. So a negatively charged ion of fluorine is called fluoride, but it's still fluorine. Okay, so fluorine usually binds to another atom when it's in that negatively charged ionic state, and it's usually going to be a salt like sodium. So fluoride is going to be found in like a sodium fluoride molecule usually. And what's important about sodium fluoride is that it prevents cavities and tooth decay by replacing a chemical that's called hydroxyapatite, which is a substance that just makes up the enamel of our teeth, which is just the outer coating of our teeth. So when plaque, which is just the gunk that accumulates between our teeth, and it's why it's so important for us to brush that off every morning and every night. So when plaque becomes acidic through a process that's called demineralization, it dissolves your tooth enamel, which is really dangerous and can lead to the decay of the tooth itself. When you introduce sodium fluoride through either toothpaste or drinking water, what this molecule does is it literally rebuilds the enamel on your teeth, and it makes them stronger and resistant to decay. So that's the idea behind fluoride and why it is so important to have it in some context in your water supply or in your toothpaste.
Sarah, can I just jump in real quick?
Please do. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that. It's just like, what even are we talking about, first of all?
Love it. And I just wanted to add, you already said this, but it's naturally occurring. It's a mineral. It's found in soil. It's found in water. It's found in rocks. It's actually present in almost all soil and water, but levels will vary. And there are certain places that have, naturally occurring levels of fluoride that are higher than in other areas. And we're going to talk about that in a second. It's also released into the environment when rocks containing fluoride are dissolved by water. And fluoride can also be released by or from volcanic emissions. Now, another very big piece of the conversation is, why do we care so much about fluoride? Now, obviously, I think, well, Sarah, you just said it. Obviously, there's a very big connection to oral health, to dental caries and cavities. And once again, public health is a victim of its own success. Mm-hmm. And I think many folks don't realize that people would die all the time from dental infections that were, that just got out of control, and obviously were not treated. So kind of cool, not cool, but I just wanted to bring up a little bit of the history. Yeah. So deaths from dental abscesses are obviously, I mean, they're exceedingly rare today. This is not something that people commonly die from. Thank you, public health. But just 200 years ago, they were a major cause of mortality. So I don't know if y'all know about the London Bills of Mortality, but they started recording causes of death in the early 1600s.
I've never heard of this. This is new to me.
It's really cool. Again, we'll link to some of this stuff. We could talk about this for hours, but literally the word teeth was consistently ranked as the 5th or 6th leading cause of death. And even up until the early 1900s, dental infections resulted in death between 10 to 40% of the time. So what happened? So how are we even talking? How is this connection made between fluoride and dental health? So in the early 20th century, dentists in Colorado noticed that a concerning number of residents had large permanent brown stains on their teeth. And this is a condition that would later be defined as fluorosis. And we could talk a little bit more about that. So by 1931, scientists pinned the cause of this disorder, fluorosis, to high levels of fluoride that were naturally occurring in certain in drinking water in certain areas. But interestingly, they also found that those very same residents had shown remarkably low rates of tooth decay. So they started doing some more investigation. It was a whole thing. The head of the dental hygiene unit and the NIH, which at the time was known as the Hygienic Laboratory, led all these studies to determine how much fluoride could exist in water without causing fluorosis, but would still be protective against these oral hygiene issues. And so then by the late 1930s, Dr. H. Trentley Dean, would have been important to mention his name, revealed that fluoride in drinking water of up to 1 part per million largely avoided fluorosis. And then there were all these landmark studies, and I know, Sarah, you're going to get into some of those studies, but there was one study that came out of Grand Rapids in 1945, and then Newburgh-Kingston in 1950, which demonstrated significant cavity reduction in communities with water fluoridation. Okay,
Yeah,
where do we go next?
I was gonna say, like, I love how scientists think sometimes. I mean, like, I just think this was just I think it's very cool. I mean, they noticed this phenomenon was occurring, and they were like, okay, clearly this has something to do with the teeth. And then they were able to make that connection between fluoride and tooth decay. And in this one community, they were saying, okay, well, why are these people, they have this resistance, and then X amount of years later, it's public policy, and then like more widespread, like now people aren't dying from tooth decay anymore.
Exactly. And it's good that you mentioned policy, because in 1951, that's where water fluoridation became a public health policy. And the recommended level for community water fluoridation has changed a bit over time, but the current CDC recommended level for community water fluoridation is 0.7 milligrams per liter. Now, we have to talk about why this is in the news right now. So briefly, and again, we really did a deep dive on this, but recently the NTP, the National Toxicology Program, released this big report on fluoride. And one of the main takeaways, and this is what has been picked up by media, it's all over the headlines, is that they found an association with very high levels of naturally occurring fluoride with a reduction in IQ. Now, obviously, especially if you're a parent reading this, you're like, oh my goodness, my child is, young and developing. I'm freaking out now about fluoride. Totally understandable. There were so many issues with this report. There's actually a lot of controversy with it because it was being written for years. And then when experts were reviewing the methodologies, they flagged major issues with some of the methods that were being employed. But it still came out. The American Dental Association is none too pleased about it. And here's why. So first of all, none of the studies that were, this was an analysis, right? Data from several different countries were pooled and analyzed to come to this conclusion. But the data were taken from countries, first of all, none of the countries were the US. These were all outside the US. And we're talking about places with very high levels of naturally occurring fluoride. And remember what I said, what we were just talking about. In the US, community water fluoridation, the limit is set at 0.7 milligrams per liter. The studies were looking at 1.5 milligrams per liter or higher. That's more than double what is currently approved for community water fluoridation in this country.
Yeah, and I
The
think if I
other
could
bit,
just jump in for a second and just like make a differentiation between naturally occurring and then the addition of fluoride. So, I mean, depending on where you live geographically, right, it does make a difference as to how much of fluoride is naturally occurring in the water source itself, just by virtue of I think the geology and the structure of the earth and the locations where the water is being taken from. So that is what varies greatly in some cases between location to location. And that's why different countries have different recommendations for the amount of fluoride that's even required to be added to the water source. Because when this was first, back in the early 1900s, when it was the first connection between fluoride and teeth health, dental health was first made, I mean, there was no fluoride that was being added to the water. It was just that was all naturally occurring. And right, Jess? Like, so that's,
yes.
yeah. So that I think that's a very important thing too, is that these things, it really depends where you're conducting the analysis geographically.
100%. And in the US, only about, and I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but about 0.6% of Americans are exposed to levels of 1.5 milligrams per liter or higher, which is what was included in this big report. And again, as Sarah just said, that's naturally occurring. This is not like the public health, officials are adding fluoride to the water at those levels. Now, for folks who live in those areas, I mean, that it is worth a conversation. I mean, there is fluoride that's naturally occurring at those high levels, so maybe some action needs to be taken. Okay, but let's put a pin in that, because for the large majority of Americans, for over 99% of Americans, we're not exposed to those levels of fluoride. Now, another big issue, and Sarah, I definitely want to turn it over to you in just a sec, is that we're talking about when you actually dig into what these studies found. They found a reduction of about 2 to 5 points in IQ. Now, that, I mean, not to minimize that, but that's not, I mean, I don't know how clinically significant 2 to 5 points is.
Right.
And I also know there are a lot of problems with IQ measurement. Sorry, go on, Sarah.
But I mean, like, this is a very common theme in science and data analysis in general. And when it comes to statistics, you can reach statistical significance in a study, which means that two groups kind of mathematically are distinct from one another. But then you also have to take into account the biology of it all, right? So it's like you can maybe find that two groups in experimental or control condition are distinct, but by how much, right? And 2 to 5 IQ points, when you take into account that the average IQ of the population is a 100, and 86% of the population scores within 15 points in either direction of that 100, and that's still considered average. 2 to 5 points. I mean, one could argue that is not necessarily biologically significant in every instance.
Okay, a few more things. I just want to sort of put a bow on the NTP discussion and then really dig into a little bit more about IQ. And then also, Sarah, just really pick your brain as a neurobiologist about other things that we need to talk about in this conversation. So another very major flaw to the NTP report, which is the thing that's been picked up and, by headlines, is it completely ignores the benefits of fluoride, right? So it was a very unbalanced, one-sided analysis of fluoride. Now, a couple of questions that come up in this conversation, and this is sort of a pseudo heard from the herd segment right now because folks have submitted a ton of questions about fluoride over the last few months. Okay, so I'm drinking water and then I'm also using fluoride toothpaste. Isn't it too much? First of all, our bodies are amazing at processing things, right? So that's first of all. And also we have to talk about how topical fluoride and ingested fluoride, there are different mechanisms of action, and they actually work together to prevent cavities. So fluoridated water keeps a low level of fluoride in the mouth all day, where fluoride toothpaste provides a much higher concentration at important times of the day, like at bedtime. So both types of fluoride strengthen the outer tooth enamel, like you were talking about, Sarah, and slow the activity of bacteria that causes cavities. So together, the two sources offer more protection than using either one, one or the other. Now, the other very big thing we have to talk about, I'm sorry, just quickly as a public health scientist, if we do not talk about health equity in this conversation, I have failed as a public health scientist. People are always like, I'll just use fluoride toothpaste. This assumes that people have access to fluoride toothpaste.
Or can afford it.
Can afford it or have access to to dental care, or can take the time out of work and go to see the dentist, or take their child to go see the dentist on a regular basis, or get fluoride varnishes and proper oral care and all that good stuff. This, it's terrible, but millions of people don't have that kind of access. And so the community water fluoridation gives those people access. And that is reflected and demonstrated so clearly by the data, where we see at the population level, when we put fluoride in the water supply, we saw a stark reduction in these dental issues. So we have to talk about
and
that.
Death related to them, right?
Exactly. One other thing, I'm sorry, Sarah, I feel like I'm completely rambling right now.
This is all things we have to cover too. I'm looking at the outline now.
Yes. Another thing that comes up a lot is, fluorosis. And I know we touched on it briefly. Fluorosis absolutely is a real thing. No one is denying that fluorosis, is real. But long-term ingestion of excess fluoride, especially in infancy and childhood, when the teeth are being formed, can lead to this dental fluorosis. Now, the characteristics of this chronic condition usually vary. So sometimes they're just these really light white lines or flecks, where that are white on teeth. I don't know if you all know what we're talking about here. I could also link to some pictures, or they can be brown stains on teeth. Now,
and that's what was discovered in Colorado when this was first being discovered. This connection between fluoride and dental health.
Exactly.
Right, like the people in this community they had these dark spots on their teeth.
Exactly. And typically it is just a superficial issue, right? Where you see, like I'm describing, these flecks on your teeth, these white spots or potentially brown spots. There is a risk of more severe cases of fluorosis. It is so extraordinarily and exceedingly rare. And there is no indication. We have no evidence, no data to show that fluorosis is caused by the recommended level of fluoride in public tap water. Again, we're talking about levels in the United States, correct. We're talking about these extremely high levels of naturally occurring fluoride. All right. Oh, one other little thing. I'm sorry. And then we're going to talk IQ. I'm over to you. But so the other little wrinkle is that this federal judge just recently made a ruling on fluoride that has also sort of further confused things for folks. He basically found, or has ruled, that the EPA needs to do more analysis on this topic, that there was enough evidence, especially in light of the NTP report, that we need to do a bit more investigation on the impact of fluoride and optimal levels of fluoride. Unfortunately, some folks are taking this ruling to mean that the scientific evidence shows that fluoride is bad or harmful, and that is not the case at all.
I think it's that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the scientific process, right? I mean, just because just because more research is warranted on a topic does not mean that that data is suggesting one thing or another thing, and in fact, it means that it's not suggesting really anything definitive at all. It's just suggesting like, hey, we need to look into this a little bit more. Like, this is an important thing. People are concerned about it. It is scientifically a very interesting and important question. Like, let's do more research on it. That's all.
Love that. And exactly. And that's the beauty of the scientific process, right? Okay, Sarah, let's talk a bit more about IQ and all this stuff, because again, I'm sure that there are people who are understandably concerned about this. So can we do a little bit more of a deep dive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so let's even just define what is IQ? What are we talking about when we say IQ? Because there is this it's something that is sort of a hot button topic, but it's something that people, I don't think, really fully understand. It's a very nuanced measure, actually. So general intelligence, or it's often referred to as the G factor, is an assessment that was originally developed by French psychologists, was originally developed for children who were struggling in school. And this measure was used in order to identify those children who needed extra academic help. So that's where IQ originally started with. And the problem is, though, that there is no single agreed upon definition of general intelligence. Intelligence is just a mechanism that's used to solve problems, but it's not really one single thing. And that's why IQ is so difficult to measure, because it's hard to define, and intelligence manifests itself in a very wide range of behaviors that are often extremely difficult to quantify. So, these modern tests that are often referred to as psychometric instruments, these IQ tests, they can assess a very small portion of what can conceivably be defined as intelligence. And it assesses some certain measures of abstract logic, but it fails to take into account certain things like emotional intelligence and practical intelligence, long-term memory. And another really important thing too is that IQ, which I don't think I mentioned yet, it stands for intelligence quotient. Like, that's all that IQ stands for, and it's an attempt to measure general intelligence. But what a lot of people don't realize, and what is very important to take into account, especially when we're talking about children, is that IQ in recent years, it's been identified that IQ can actually change. It is not necessarily fixed. It is not something that you are born with this IQ and you are destined to have this IQ for the rest of your life. Like, that is not, as it turns out, how this works. Environmental conditions, education, very many a variety of different factors, and the interaction of these factors can alter general intelligence. And so all of these things, it's important to take into account. Because of all of these things, whenever I see IQ used as any kind of a definitive mark for cognitive function, it sends up all kinds of red flags for me. Because it's, and especially when we're connecting IQ with something as fundamentally beneficial to public health as water fluoridation. Well,
sorry, I was muted.
Oh, okay.
I'm so sorry about that.
I was like, you looked like you were going to say something, and then I was like, okay, what is it? Say something. And then
yes, something so profound. No,
yeah.
Maybe you touched on this, but how do we even assess IQ? Like, because there are these tests, right, that aim to measure a person's intellectual abilities by giving them these tasks, right, that
Right.
focus on reasoning, problem solving, and logic. I do want to raise here the issue. A lot of folks, I've seen some concerns that there may be some, biases against certain racial or ethnic groups at the IQ. The ways that we're assessing IQ could potentially be biased for certain groups. Even just this measurement, it's imperfect, right? This is our
Right.
proxy, our best proxy, but it's not like it's a perfect science. I think that's why
It's really, really not. And I mean, if you talk to any sort of neuropsychologist or, people whose job it is to sort of assess, and I think the people that are most well equipped to talk about this are the people that actually work with children and are attempting to identify difficulties in academic circles. I mean,
Mhm.
and that even is not just a measure of intelligence. Like, that's a measure of like one specific form of learning, which is the type of learning that we promote in school systems.
I think that's why, and we touched on this briefly, this like quibbling over 2 to 5 IQ points, like, what does that even mean? Like, is that, or does it mean
Yeah.
anything? Like,
Or
it
is
just,
it within the margin of error? Because
it,
these tests are, like, I don't want to say subjective, but like it's there is some amount of error that can occur in any form of measurement, right? I mean, when
right.
I measure things in the lab at the benchtop, when I measure volumes of a liquid in a a test tube or something, like there's going to be some amount of error that's introduced
Mhm.
from me as a human. And when you've got a
Right.
human assessing the intelligence level of another human, there's also going to be error involved in that too. And that error could
Right.
be as large as 2 to 5 IQ points.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you brought up another interesting point before we hit record, and I think it's worth getting into it. But so we're talking about fluoride's potential impact, right, on IQ and neurocognition. What about dental issues? Is there an impact? Because, and before I turn it over to you, like, I know from a chronic illness perspective that we talk about how poor dental health is linked to a range of other chronic health issues, right? Like heart disease, diabetes, stroke,
Right.
arthritis, complications, kidney disease, and even certain cancers. Because the bacteria from the mouth can enter the bloodstream, can affect other
Correct.
organs in the body, and lead to systemic inflammation. And
Mhm.
by the way, I've also seen it linked to like Alzheimer's disease and other cognitive issues. So,
Right.
Dr. Sarah Scheinman, talk to us.
I mean, because with all of this media sensationalization that's going on regarding this topic, a lot of people are calling, right, Jess, for the removal of fluoride from water sources, right?
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes.
let's take that to its logical conclusion now, shall we? Like, let's take that to, okay, so water, fluoride removed from the water sources. Okay. From that drastic measure, more people are going to experience dental decay, right? Because this very important public health measure is
Yes.
preventing dental decay
Yes.
and
And
tooth
we
loss in a large swath of the population. So those
yes, and
people
we
that,
have so much data to support that. Sorry, Sarah,
right,
go on.
and we're absolutely going to link to all of this. So let's assume
Yes.
that happens. Okay, so there's going to be, I mean, and the idea behind removing fluoride from the water source, according to certain people, is to like promote the brain health of the population. So all of these people now that don't have access to fluoride in their drinking water are going to experience increased levels of dental decay, and in most severe cases, tooth loss. And as it turns out, there is a very well documented effect of dental decay on cognitive function and, as it turns out, IQ as well. So
Bum bum
this is a
bum.
very it really, we're coming full circle, because like if the argument for removing fluoride from the water source is focused on promoting the brain health of the population, then you have to take it all of the way to the end and say like, all right, well, ultimately this measure is going to really probably make everyone's brain health substantially worse.
So how does that work? Can you talk a little bit about, and in layperson terms, but like how is it that like this, I mentioned Alzheimer's, and like we're talking about how there is a potential impact on cognition and like how does that work? Can you say anything about like what's the mechanism of action there? Like how does that happen? How is there an impact
Right.
from yeah.
I mean, with regards to Alzheimer's disease, like I don't know
Okay.
if that's a little bit shaky. I mean, there hasn't been a ton of work done specifically looking at the effects of dental decay on the susceptibility to neuro to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia. There, the connection there is a little bit shaky, but
Mm-hmm.
when you think about the anatomy of everything, I mean, your teeth are, I mean, they're located in your head, right? And your brain is kind of like right. Everyone who isn't looking at the YouTube video, I'm like pointing to my head right now. I'm like, okay, your brain is right here. Your teeth are right here. I mean, they're very close to each other, and your brain has cranial nerves that kind of connect the brain to the rest of the body, and a lot of those nerves are directly connected to the mouth area. So that's why when you have like a toothache, you feel it so intensely in your head because it's all right there. It's all right proximal to each other. Jess is shivering right now.
Yeah, I know. Is there anything worse than dental pain? I mean, my
There's
goodness, I
nothing.
just said, oh,
But
yeah.
which is just to say that like everything is just so close together up there, and like I think that proximity has to
Mm-hmm.
do. I mean, there's this concept in biology, the connection between structure and function, right? So I think just a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you're experiencing tooth decay, there's this buildup of bacteria and a whole mess of gunk and bad stuff that's in your mouth. It's so close to your brain
Right.
that
Right. Right.
it just naturally makes sense that it would be very detrimental to your cognitive health and your neurological health to have poor dental hygiene in general.
So, Sarah, I mean, you're raising like there's a very fundamental underlying concept here where people need to think through consequences of one action. Something is going to, everything is a trade off, right? And if we remove something, something is going to happen or we'll replace it with something else. So, you're talking about let's say we remove fluoride from the water. Yes, there's going to be a lot of folks who can still access fluoride topically through toothpaste and mouthwash. There's going to be millions of people who don't have access to those things. We've already talked about the health equity angle. Okay. So then people talk about this other thing called hydroxyapatite, which you touched on. There are folks who are turning to hydroxyapatite toothpaste, for example, as an alternative to fluoride. Okay, there is some evidence that it might have the same, when used topically, the same impact as fluoride. That's good. It's a growing body of evidence. We don't have, for all the people calling for long-term data, we don't have the long-term data that we do have for fluoride for hydroxyapatite. We don't have that. Another factor that people don't consider is that hydroxyapatite is a lot more expensive than fluoride. So what does that mean? That's going to further limit the access to these products for folks. So I guess it's just, I mean, we could talk about this in the context of so many different things. I talk about it a lot with like things that are added to our food. Like, okay, you want to remove preservatives? Okay, well then there won't be any shelf life, and we have to talk about food supply, and like there's a million things that we could talk about it. But I'm so glad
it reminds me of that children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie.
I don't know that book.
Oh, it's I mean, it's a book that teaches children about like causality and a chain of events. It's like, if you like if you give a mouse a cookie, like then all of these other things are going to happen, and then like it basically it's about connection to of different events and causality and like
I love that, by the way, and that's the type of stuff. Just this is a little tangential, but I think that the fundamental ways or like understanding fundamentally how to just think and process information, like something as simple as that, that's so important to introduce to kids. And it doesn't have to be in the context of science. Like that's just a fundamental concept that applies to all the things.
Yeah.
And it's something that I personally feel so strongly that like everyone calling for, remove it from the water, remove this from our foods, remove this from X, Y, and Z. Okay.
Then
Well,
what?
like you said, then what? So I don't know. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but do you feel like there's anything else in the conversation of fluoride or oral health or anything that we haven't covered here? I feel like
No, I mean, I think we did a
we
pretty
did
good
some
job.
good
And then,
stuff
like,
here.
we also should mention we have a lot of other content. So, like, if people are interested in learning more and reading into, like the studies, the very flawed studies, as we've mentioned, and just wanting to know a little bit more details, we're going to link all of this in the show notes. So, there's plenty
Yes.
to read up on and follow up on if you have more
And
questions.
And again, for the folks listening who are like, but I saw a study that, and yes, you undoubtedly, if you want to find a study that links fluoride to some negative outcome, you're going to find, you will be able to find it. That is also a concept called confirmation bias. If you're looking for something, right, you'll find it, and it will then confirm and reinforce
We talked about all
those
of this. We
beliefs.
talked all about this last week on our podcast on our episode about cognitive biases.
With the amazing Dr. Kristen Pantagani, who I got to meet in person, and I'm obsessed with her. That's a whole other conversation. We'll talk about that. But yes, those studies exist. We didn't talk about it, but though a lot of those studies were either dealing with, well, we did talk about the naturally occurring fluoride at levels more than double what is, the context of community water fluoridation. But you can also find it in US studies, but typically in rats and preclinical research. Again, we're talking about fluoride levels that are so much higher than what we're all exposed to, even when you factor in what you're drinking versus cumulatively with toothpaste and all that stuff. We factor all of those things in. Scientists are aware of those things. We think about cumulative exposure.
Right.
We are assessing for those things. We're also taking into consideration, do these things bioaccumulate? How quickly does our body process and excrete these things? All of these things are factored in, and that level, that 0.7 milligram per liter, that was so thoughtfully, so carefully considered. And again, I hope this also gives people pause to think, okay, what would happen if we removed it? And think about all the folks who don't have access to the fluoride in toothpaste and mouthwash. Sorry, now I'm rambling, but the last thing I'll say is there are some studies that show that topical fluoride is more effective than ingested fluoride, and I haven't done a deep dive into that yet, but that wouldn't surprise me. The direct application of the fluoride to the teeth, that makes sense with regard to things like remineralization, but again, that assumes that we all have access to that, and it also ignores that the combination with ingested fluoride, again, they're working in different ways, different mechanisms of action, and it further strengthens the protective factor, the protective impact of fluoride. So
it doesn't need to be one or the other.
Right. All right, Sarah, can you take us home?
Yes, I would. I gladly would. I thank you all for tuning in. We hope you learned a thing or two. I certainly did. I always learn so much for having conversations with Jess. I think that's what makes our podcast so awesome, at least from my perspective, is because like I understand things at this like the molecular level, and I can explain the chemistry, but as far as things like the historical context and like the health equity angle, like these are things that I don't necessarily think about in my day-to-day scientific career. And it's so important that we are able to consider both of these perspectives when we're talking about things as complicated and nuanced and important as what we discussed here today. So just thank you, Jess, so much. I always learn a ton from you. And and with that, please join us next week on your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.